From California, Ms. Lofgren is recognized.
First, I must point out that you are simply incorrect as to the S visa. Section 245J of the Immigration Nationality Act allows for S visa beneficiaries to apply for green cards if they contribute to criminal or terrorism investigations or prosecutions. Secondarily, I want to go to the two sections of the U visa provisions that would be changed by the amendment that are very important. First, the active investigation or prosecution requirement in the underlying bill is a huge mistake. And I would ask unanimous consent to put in the record a letter dated May 7th received from a number of law enforcement officials, including someone from the San Antonio, Texas Police Department.
With that objection.
The law enforcement officials point out that it is sometimes certainly not the victim's fault that you can't be in active investigation. For example, the perpetrator may be eluding arrest and yet still be a threat to the victim. Or, and I'll give you an example of a case brought to my attention of a young girl who was 12 who was raped multiple times by a friend. She was afraid and confided only to her friends. Finally, the perpetrators moved away, and the friend who she confided in told their pastor, who told her parents, and then they finally sought the U visa. The police consulted with the prosecutor, who didn't want to sign a certification for this little girl until her testimony had been completed, so she testified. The abuser was convicted, and under the underlying bill, this little girl would no longer be eligible for a visa because there was no active investigation. It was all done by the time they applied. So she would be out of luck. I don't think that was probably what was intended, but that's how the bill is written. It is important that you have the ability to get a permanent residence visa if there is hardship and it's in the national interest after you get a U visa. And you have situations, and I'll just mention a couple that have been brought to my attention, where you have substantial abuse. In the case of Maria, who was married to a legal resident, she was abused repeatedly. Finally, she received her visa. Her husband was convicted. Her husband was deported. But if she were on a visa that was only 4 years in length, she would be back with him in El Salvador, and she would be abused and potentially even killed. There are so many cases, I can't read them all, but as the law enforcement officials point out in their letter, and I'll read it, if the U visa becomes a temporary 4-year visa after which the victim must leave the United States or be deported, victims will not risk the increased danger to themselves and their children to come forward and work with law enforcement to prosecute criminals. If victims do come forward under the proposed law changes, this is what will happen to them. They will report the crime, work with law enforcement to prosecute the perpetrator. If the perpetrator is convicted and deported, or only deported, he will be removed from the United States and lie in wait to retaliate against the victim, knowing that in 4 years she too will be deported and he can take his revenge. So the cost of the victim and her family will be too high. With the proposed changes, the victims will choose not to report the crime, to stay in the United States, and suffer escalating violence in communities where the police will be there if they were only to be called. You know, we made a decision 7 years ago on a bipartisan basis that it was more important to provide for the U visa and the possibility of permanent relief than to have women murdered by their abusing spouses. I think whether or not that is the intention, we're departing from that in this bill. And we're saying we'd rather have the women murdered than to provide for permanent status so that they can come forward. That is not where we should be. I think it's really an appalling decision. It's at variance with what we've done with the Violence Against Women Act for since I've been a member of this committee, since 1995 and 96. We have worked together to say the victims are going to come first, and now they don't. The abusers are coming first in this law. I think it's a shame,
Gentlewoman's
and
time
Ms.
has
Jackson's
expired.
Lee's amendment would fix it.